following is a production of the Antique Wireless Association and the Arthur A. Collins Legacy Association.
If you think about the many of the great leaders in the past, you think about the Edisons and the Abraham Lincolns and the Marconis and more recently the Steve Jobses. Arthur Collins was like that. And that is big gambles, big risks, big failures, big successes. But those people are remembered for their successes.
In the 1920s, radio was still in its infancy. People got their news from the newspaper. Until The Jazz Singer opened in 1927, movies were silent. TV was decades in the future. In cities and larger towns, one could, with the help of an operator, use the telephone to talk to somebody nearby. But to hear the voice of a national figure, you turned on the radio. Sound quality was often poor, yet the country was fascinated by radio. Improvements came from relatively few engineers, as well as from dedicated amateurs. One such amateur was Arthur Collins, a teenager living in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. A licensed ham operator at age 14, he quickly exhausted everything he could read on radio and furthered his skills through contacts with other enthusiasts. His attic station became a laboratory for better ways to communicate over long distances. At 15, Arthur maintained reliable communication when few others could with the 1925 Macmillan expedition to northern Greenland. Using radios he had designed and built and techniques for shortwave communication he had worked out in advance with the ship's radio operator, John Reinertz. Arthur Collins' success, in contrast to the U.S. Navy's failure with longer wave equipment, soon led to front-page headlines. Collins Radio Company was incorporated in 1933. Its early products were advanced, high-quality amateur radio transmitters, designed by Arthur and manufactured in his basement. Innovative design, attention to detail, and exceptionally high quality were his trademark, providing steady growth through the Depression years of the 1930s. During World War II, Collins Radio produced massive numbers of advanced radios, including highly classified direction finders to locate U-boats and the legendary ART-13 airborne transmitter with its remote auto-tune feature, highly prized by combat pilots. Over 90,000 were produced. During the war, Collins Radio grew from 150 to over 3,500 employees. The Cold War followed, and Collins had to accept a sudden loss of income as war production ceased. The years that followed truly defined Collins Radio. Other companies retooled to produce for the consumer market, hungry for goods not available during the war. Arthur Collins directed his engineers to advance the art of electronics beyond current knowledge and technology. His vision was to be proven correct over and over again. During the 1950s, Collins designed and built ocean-spanning transmitters for the Voice of America, microwave for telephone and data communication, tactical data systems for the Navy, UHF military radios, and its famous single sideband HF military and amateur radios. Based on its reputation, Collins was chosen to supply radios for the X-15 rocket plane and the ground stations and onboard radios for Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo spacecraft.
That's affirmative, Buzz.
The voice and pictures of the first human to set foot on the moon came via Collins radio equipment.
You're in our field of view now.
Collins' avionics business took off after World War II as commercial aviation expanded. By the 1960s, Collins was recognized as the world leader in avionics, a Fortune 500 company with, at its peak, over 24,000 employees. Collins Radio was also an early leader in data communications. Its Kineplex system, introduced in the 1950s, used modular design and boasted the first commercially successful modem. Arthur Collins forecast the coming revolution in computers. The Collins architecture combined communication and computer technology in a distributed network, now, 50 years later, the industry norm. Collins C8400 computers ran airline reservation systems and other data switching jobs. But at the time, computer memory was extremely expensive and couldn't support the design potential of the new C system. This more advanced system was not a commercial success, and along with other factors outside the company, ultimately led to the merger of Collins into Rockwell International. The Collins legacy for innovation lives on in the current Rockwell Collins organization. Yet the founder remains an enigmatic figure. What was the secret to the success that advanced Collins Radio Company from a basement operation through the decades to become one of the nation's leading communications companies? Because he was a shy person rarely giving interviews or public speeches, the story of Arthur Collins is little known, even within the electronics industry. We will rely on the voices of those who knew and worked with him to explore three key themes: his devotion to basic engineering research, his ability to predict future needs in technology, and most of all, a culture of excellence and innovation in the workplace, in design, and in manufacture.
Arthur Collins' vision was maybe 20 years out. He was looking and having some of his key people look at what is the world going to be like in 20 years. Let's get on that thing and go ahead and figure out how to do it and develop it and bring it in here right now. And he had it exactly right. If you look at the communication technologies that are being used now, not only in DoD but in commercial applications, many of those were the ideas that he had 45 years ago.
I always thought he was one of the best strategic planners a company could have. He seemed to know intuitively what something that was going to be needed in 4 or 5 years from now. And he would start the ball rolling.
The first time I heard about the McMillan expedition was at my grandmother's house. It was from my grandmother. She told me all about the fact that my dad and his radio were the only effective communication at a time when the Navy could not accomplish it. Because, although she didn't give me the detail, we know later it was because of a choice of a wavelength that had the right kind of propagation characteristics. And she told me about him going down to the telegraph office and relaying this information to the powers that be, as well as to National Geographic, and eventually being given probably a train ticket at that time to go to meet the ship on the East Coast. I remember he took a trip to the Rocky Mountains and beyond. It was probably a Model A delivery truck. Took everything out from the back and put in a radio station. He had Wynne Salisbury, who went on to become an atomic physicist. And the other companion was Paul Engel, who went on to help found a writer's workshop. But they had quite an adventure. They took this little truck over really primitive roads up to very high altitude, which is probably interesting from the standpoint of radio communication. And so I think people came to Collins not because it was going to offer them the quickest advancement or maybe even the top salary, but they know they would be joining almost a family of engineers who were interested in a concept or philosophy or a particular piece of equipment and technology. And when they came in there, they knew that they may not have the highest salary, but they'd They'd have the best test equipment and the most support. And I think that also reflects kind of a Midwestern environment, a small town philosophy, and without all the formality you might see on one of the coasts or in some of the really big corporations.
The work ethic, the camaraderie was a couple of steps above what you'd find in most places. Most of those who were involved with the activities he was involved with, we've been talking about the sea system. There are hundreds of other activities that were very important that came out of the Collins Radio Company and the Collins Company subsequent to the 1970s. In avionics and military communications, an awful lot of firsts, awful lot of innovation that gets overlooked because people seem to focus in on the one aspect of what happened at the company when things kind of came to a halt.
But what he built was his spirit of wanting to get the job done and the cooperation with other people to get it done.
The emphasis was on advanced technology, not advanced technology to grow the company and grow revenues and make more profit. That wasn't what Mr. Collins was about. He was about advancing the ball down the field.
If there's a better way, you just go do it, and you didn't have to go ask permission. And I think that was part of the excitement. And manager tolerated it. Yeah, sometimes it wasn't the best way, sometimes it was a mistake, but nobody even criticized. You were ready to go do it again. And I think that excitement and the freedom to do things really caused the creativity.
Art was running an engineering company.
And that culture still shows through today.
Not only Collins himself broke ground in a number of those areas, but one of the real things that he did was build that cadre of top people. And I'm sure that the people's talent is just as great as it ever was at Collins, and I'm not surprised that they're maintaining their leadership position.
Tranquility Base, this is Houston. Can we get both of you on the camera for a minute, please?
The decade of the 1960s will always be remembered as the time we landed on the moon.
It was a big thing for the country, big thing for Collins Radio.
Every voice on an American spacecraft came back on Collins equipment. There was never a failure. I was fortunate enough to be in the Houston Control Center when the little lunar landing module was taking off from the moon. Watch that thing in progress. You know, I happened to sit next to Werner von Braun in the auditorium. He talked me through the whole thing, and he made the point, there's no repair stations on the moon. And the fact that they were able to communicate flawlessly on that Collins equipment was a real compliment.
Walter Cronkite was a big space buff. He knew personally the astronauts, and it was beyond just his job. He called Collins Radio and talked to my dad. Would you please personally narrate an explanation of the communication system? And there were other people in the room when the call came in. They didn't know who it was. And he talked a while. Nobody kept a transcript, but he basically said, I'm not going to blow my own horn. This is a team project. There are hardworking guys that wouldn't get acknowledged, and that's not right, and thank you very much, but no. And I can't imagine a corporation these days turning down someone of the statue of Walter Cronkite. And it didn't, who was on the phone, Art? Oh, that guy Cronkite from CBS. And that's as far as it went. And it just makes you cry to think of what could have been done.
And I remember one day he came into my office and he said, Bob, he said, I really wish that I had finished more mathematics and studied it more diligently, you know. He said, but I never really had time. He said, but I want to tell you, I can see these things in my mind and how they work. And, you know, in terms of, if you think back on some of the modulation schemes and radio schemes that they came up with, and it goes back to not being intimidated, that he could visualize, is what he was saying, what ought to be done and how it ought to be done. Maybe I could write some equations, but he had the vision. And my equations were describing his vision, really. But I thought that was an interesting part of his attitude, that he could see it. And if somebody else was here, he was not that far behind because he's coming. That's the way it was.
I have in my lifetime known two people that I feel have infinite capacity for knowledge, and Arthur was one of them. And I remember he came to my office one afternoon, and this whole business, the computer business, was pretty new to him. And so he was studying and learning, which he did remarkably well. And he wanted to learn more about memory systems. And he wanted to know if I knew of a good book on memory systems. That I have a book on computers that has a pretty good section in it on memories, and you're certainly welcome to borrow it. So he gave it to Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins left. The next morning was one of those that I happened to make it on time at 7:30. I came into my office, and Mr. Collins was sitting there and said, I read that book last night, and I have a couple of questions. Mr. Collins would have the man who ran the library in Dallas. He would take him a list of books, articles, papers that he was interested in, and this man became very good at finding them. And he would end up taking, a stack of books like that to Mr. Collins. And a few days later, Mr. Collins would bring that stack of books back with another list. And he didn't read the books, he absorbed them. He understood what they said and would think that you had probably read them too. Amazing man.
It was very interesting to see how he was looking at the architecture of computers as they existed in the late 50s, early 60s, and saying, so much of this architecture is really communication networking. And he said the thing that the computer brings to that, of course, is control of the network, but then it brings the capability of modifying the information that's in the network. We transmit it in communication systems. We don't modify the content. But he said, here's a way to modify it. And why do we modify it? Well, we modify it for lots of reasons. We do it for purposes of scientific reasons, of course, but we modify it in terms of managing corporations. How do we manage inventories? And how do we manage the marketing activities? How do we manage our plans? The C system is not a thing. It's not something that's built and can be sold with a gross margin on it, and it's an architecture.
It was multiple computers communicating with each other over a high-speed 32 megabit time division multiplex ring, which is a lot of technical words, but
it's an architecture based on the concepts that he was developing as he looked at computer computation and control. That's where the C came from.
But Mr. Collins' vision was to integrate computers and communications. They really should come together. He said they're not separate. They're one system. So Collins' radio company actually built this system with this ring communication. Multiple processors could be connected to that ring. So it was a multi-processor system.
In the early 1970s, the country's telephone system depended on large central exchanges, each with a massive complex of analog switches and relays called crossbar switches. In Art Collins' view, these plants were outmoded, but change was impeded by the scale of investment in them.
In reading A Time for Innovation again last night, if you just read the opening parts of it, you quickly see again that what Art really had in mind is he wanted to take on Western Electric. But, he saw multiple applications for the C system technology, but one of them was to get into all digital transmission and switching in the plain old telephone network and get rid of all this electromechanical stuff.
I went into Department of Defense and talked to Eb Rickton, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for telecommunications. He knew Collins very well, and he said, what I want you guys to do is this afternoon run over and talk to Bob Kahn in ARPA. And he's developing an ARPANET, which is a precursor to the internet. And they gave us a pretty good chunk of money, R&D money that we could use to supplement what we were doing, and we started the packet radio business as a result of that. And so we were in on the ground floor of Internet technologies because ARPANET turned into the Internet.
I spent a lot of time with the Collins management and Arthur during that period and had great respect for him. And then the deal was made, and the day it was made, I was transferred and became an employee of Collins. But it also, in my opinion, turned out to be one of the greatest investments ever made in electronics. Because of what Collins was and what it represented, and certainly what has happened to it over the years.
Well, I'm an astronomer, and one thing I'm struck with, this man, it's like one of these fireballs that streaks across the sky. A very infrequent thing, and yet the brilliancy is almost overwhelming. And when I think of Art Collins, here is a brilliant fellow, and he'll long be remembered for what he accomplished, not only for radio, but for the Cedar Rapids community and beyond. What a tremendous legacy.
The only thing I'll add is I just feel honored to have been associated with Collins Radio Company, and I don't want to put that in the past tense because I know the kind of people that work at Collins and the kind of products and systems and technology that they're delivering to their customers today. The legacy lives on.
It is necessary that we marshal the combined powers of many scientific and engineering disciplines, together with man's other creative and spiritual faculties, in an effort to build a decent and meaningful world. Whatever your field may be, your progress will depend upon your individual imagination. I urge you to give it free rein. Arthur Collins.